Good evening, everyone, and to those on Zoom. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we're meeting. I acknowledge that they teach us that the land is not ours to own, but a gift to care for and delight in. Sovereignty was never ceded. And I pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, past, present, and emerging. So my name is Pauline Ridge, and it's my pleasure to chair this session, this event in our research showcase series being presented by the ANU Law School. And tonight we're celebrating the forthcoming monograph of our colleague, Dr Akshaya Kamalnath, her book, The Corporate Diversity Jigsaw. I like jigsaws. I think it's a great title. The book is published by Cambridge University Press, and it's coming out in December this year. So apparently it's not too early to put in an advance order. So I'd encourage you to do that, and no doubt by the end of this event, we'll all be doing that. I won't spend long introducing Akshaya. She's only been our colleague for a short while. She joined ANU Law in February 2021, and despite being marooned in New Zealand for much of the intervening period, she has made her way into our hearts by participating fully and collegially in all college events. And she's also done a range of teaching into many courses so far in her short career here. Previously had appointments at Auckland University of Technology and Deakin University, and she has qualifications from India, New York, and Australia. Her research expertise, as you know, is in corporate governance, corporations and society, corporations law generally, and corporate insolvency. And so we're delighted, Akshaya, that you are going to speak to us tonight. And Akshaya is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Pauline, for such a warm introduction. Hi, everyone. It's to those present here and online. I'm really pleased to talk about this book in a kind of pre-launch or slightly before it's published. And I'll start with a backstory to the book. So I think around 2014 to 2017, when I was doing my PhD, I was thinking about diversity, but mostly on diversity in the corporate board and gender diversity in particular, because that's what the conversation was about at that time. That's what the laws and policies were about at that time. And towards the end of my PhD thesis, in the conclusion, I had this sentence saying, I think future work, I didn't say myself, but I said, I think future work should deal with diversity beyond gender and diversity beyond the board in the corporation. And so I'm glad that I've actually come and done that future work. So after my thesis, I started to make inroads into some of the areas beyond gender and beyond the board through legal journal articles. And I realized that especially in the last couple of years, I think diversity has become more and more of a conversation beyond just academic circles, beyond policy makers' discussions, and diversity has become a topic in every area, not just the corporation. So I started to think that I want to reach an audience that's wider than legal academic audience, and maybe wider than an academic audience in general. So I decided that a book was the way to go. And I decided that a slightly less erudite book was the way to go. So this is why if an academic is reading the book, I should say that you'll find the basic, like the theoretical underpinnings that you see in the beginning of any academic monograph. You'll find this at the end of my book. So I've done a bit of reverse here, and basically I start with the absolute basics in this book by saying what is diversity. That's literally my first chapter, defining diversity. And I think there is a lot of original contributions to add even in that basic question, because we've been talking about diversity at least for a number of years in the context of the upper, not even the upper echelons, but mostly just the board of directors in the corporation, and mostly just, even when we say gender diversity, it's mostly been bringing women on the board. And I thought that's really important, but it has to be widened. And the way we think of diversity probably changes depending on the level of the corporation we're thinking about, whether it's the board of directors or just below the board, the management, or the rest of the workforce. It's important everywhere, but it's probably important for different reasons, and different types of diversity are important in different levels of the company. So I guess with defining diversity, I went and picked up the dictionary, and I looked at the dictionary meaning. And I think the Cambridge English Dictionary gives you two prongs to the meaning. It says it's different types of things or people, and the next prong is different ideas. And this is where I think is the basis for the way I define diversity in the book. So there's two prongs to my definition of diversity in the corporation. So one is to do with demographics. So the whether you say gender, age, where you come from, place of origin, things like that. Even yeah, I think not really experience, but these sort of demographic features go in prong one. And in prong two, I call it viewpoint diversity, but I think I use it interchangeably with cognitive diversity, because viewpoint diversity in the US has taken a distinct political meaning that, oh, conservative Democrat. That's not what I was talking about. So although that is important as well. But basically, I take these two prongs and then I examine it at each level. Why do we want diversity on the board? Why do we want diversity in the management, and what type of diversity is useful? If I look at the research, even policy discussions citing reasons to have, say, in countries that have laws saying you need to mandate a certain number of women on company boards, if you look at those discussions justifying the laws, they're talking about studies that say that women on the board result in better firm performance. So a lot of these sort of arguments are what makes the business case. And they don't really talk so much about the equality motivations of why we started talking about diversity in the first place. And I think the logic for that is this is the best way to sell it to business. So this is how we start to rely on what is broadly known as the business case. And in the book, and even in prior work, I've dismissed the business case because I don't like relying on this sort of instrumental ideas or justifications. But at the same time, I've picked up on certain parts of the business case or certain studies, which I think are quite empirically rigorous. They're looking at what aspects of corporate governance can possibly improve with different perspectives on the board. And I think for different perspectives, the proxy being used is gender. And in that context, I think there's some literature that actually talks about it can enhance monitoring. If you have people on the board that actually ask more questions of management, that's useful, except the underlying assumption is that women will ask more questions. So I think you can see why I'm pushing back, right? If in all these years we've had independent directors on the board to do exactly this, independent directors are usually defined in various corporate legislations across the world to mean financial independence from the management, but they haven't been actually resisting in terms of to use what Professor Erica Beecher-Monish uses the word psychological independence. So they haven't been able to push back or present different proposals to what the management is proposing. So if that hasn't worked, then how can we say that now by almost add women and stir the magic recipe works? So it's probably not the best way to go about it. So I've been interested in the equality arguments, but I've also taken some things from the business case. Like if we're saying that women ask more questions, and this comes from some good studies from Norway, where there was a legislation to mandate women on boards, and apparently the board process is improved. And to compare that with US studies where they didn't really improve, I think what's coming out is that the outsider status of these women on the boards helped them ask questions. So if you can have another scenario where women have taken exactly the same pathway as their male counterparts or other people on the board, they've also had CEO positions, etc., then they probably behave in the exact same way as their male peers. So these are the kind of things I've picked up and said that maybe you can have diversity in other types. So whether it's race or age diversity or experiential diversity, ultimately, probably you need people who can actually have psychological independence from management at that level. At the management level, I say that, to an extent, what's really good is this, I don't know if it's probably an equality argument rather than the business case argument, but basically to say that there is a diverse member, whether a woman, a racial minority, whatever, holding this position, then other people like them in the workforce can see that, okay, there is a pathway for me in this company to make it to that position. So there are those arguments to it. And in the workforce, which we don't focus on as much, I think there's a huge argument to say that we need to get the data of how many diverse people are leaving the workforce regularly at a certain level. Why is this happening? Why can't we retain certain types of people in this firm? So those are the kind of things I introduce with what is diversity and why it matters at each level. I'll skip past the second chapter, which is talking about diversity in corporate governance. And there, I think I take existing literature about diversity and the boards, and I pull that on to management levels and say that in a lot of big companies, management probably does a lot of important, is responsible for a lot of important operational issues, etc. And so you probably need more diversity there. But we've had quotas at the board level because it was just easier to implement. Then I guess there is some discussion there about this fad of hiring chief diversity officers in the recent past, and how I talk about how that's not really useful to just have a position unless you give that person enough authority and power to affect change. So that's the amount I'll talk about chapter 2. But chapter 3, I think, is also another new piece of the puzzle that hasn't been explored as much in the literature, at least in the corporate space. So chapter 3 talks about social movements. And so this is pressure coming from society through supercharged by social media, essentially. When there is negative information about a company in the broad area of diversity, you usually have a lot of backlash, and then there's companies responding to that much more than they would respond to, say, a quota law. And I've looked at a few examples, and I think my take there is that what we've seen now is that there's a lot of short-term responses. What we need is long-term thinking of how to deal with issues about diversity in the firm. So we're getting started with the society beginning to speak up. It's just that companies need to take a long-term perspective, not just in profits, but also in terms of societal issues like diversity. And chapter 4 is this core legal chapter, which looks at the laws dealing with diversity across, I think I look at some countries in Europe, so Norway, France, Germany, the US, and UK. And a lot of the European, apart from UK, a lot of those other countries have used quota laws like I've been talking about. What I really like about the UK system is that it's not a quota law. It asks for disclosure, but essentially it keeps the definition of diversity quite wide. It also mentions cognitive diversity. So in a sense, when you're hiring a diverse candidate and you're justifying why we hired this person, you can talk of a lot of different attributes that the person brings, not just that this person is a woman or a racial minority or whatever you think helps you gain reputational value at the time. So I like that about the UK system, because the fact of having a quota and companies hiring as a response to quotas usually results in what people call tokenism. But I think even when the company isn't acting with the intention of just hiring a token woman, the person that's hired is usually kind of perceived as a token if it's in response to a law. And I think that's the good thing about the UK system. And the UK has a number of, not in its corporate governance code, but there have been a number of reports that have been pushing companies to also think about racial diversity. So I think it's a little more broader as against the countries in Europe. And I also look at recent developments in the US, which in California, NASDAQ and California have introduced a kind of quota, but the way they describe whom you need to have that quota for is quite interesting, because they mention a few categories. Like, I think they say some gender diversity, some person of Latin origin. So they mention a few things. And then there's people responding, someone from an Arab community saying, why don't we have a place in this? So there's always different constituencies saying, why not us? So it's always very hard to give a very detailed definition of diversity and say, you need to have exactly these categories. So after, and this is like a quick look at chapter 4, but basically my argument in chapter 4 is that what we really need is firm specific solutions, because for each firm, the type of diversity that's important is quite different. And how can the law incentivize firm specific solutions? Not by emphasizing numbers, but by emphasizing qualitative disclosures. So what are you doing about getting diversity, not only at the board, but also in the rest of your company? So maybe different companies have different answers to that. And so there's some sort of social justice innovation that can come out of that competition. So that's kind of what I want to say about chapter 4. And I think this naturally leads to chapter 5, where since I'm talking about firm specific solutions, look beyond the board, look beyond the board and management, look at the workforce, etc. Chapter 5 is talking about culture, because organizational culture says a lot about whether you can hire and retain diverse candidates, because the law can get you to hire diverse candidates, but they won't necessarily stay if they feel like unwelcome guests. So that chapter 5 is about how you can address workplace culture, how you can incentivize anonymous reporting of incidents within your company, but also kind of ensure that we don't get into an us versus them mentality. So usually mentoring programs usually have racial minorities mentored by racial minority senior people in the companies. Rather, there should be more of a interaction across groups, and we shouldn't heighten the fault lines as much. Companies need to be places where you meet different people and get along. So I think that's kind of my emphasis for the broader company, but I focus also on board culture. So if you have diverse board candidates, are you actually listening to those diverse perspectives that they bring, or are you just not giving them a chance to speak? Because there's been research saying that actually happens to women directors or directors. Actually, there's only research about women, not so much about other types of diverse people. Okay, so that was chapter 5, and I finished, like I said, with the theoretical chapter with chapter 6. And my only comment about what I do with the theories is that, so in corporate law, if you're familiar with the corporate law theories, it seems like there's arguments across different. So there's two arguments and two sides that never seem to meet. But I think in chapter 6, I say that, oh, look, there can be a meeting point. It's not that hard if we kind of get to a softer version of shareholder primacy and a softer version of stakeholder theories. There is a meeting point that can actually address these sorts of diversity and also other issues that are kind of at the intersection of corporate law or corporations and society. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that in future, whether it is climate change or other sorts of issues. So I kind of use chapter 6 to give myself a blueprint to pick up on in my next book, I guess. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that was great, Akshaya. And I particularly like the fact that you've written a book deliberately that's going to appeal to a wide audience. So that sort of sounds like, you know, my sort of book, actually. So you've tried to be engaging to non-lawyers as well. And it also sounds amazing, the comparative law aspect, that you've covered so many different jurisdictions. So we'll open it up for questions, and I've got some in reserve as well, but I'll just see if others more informed, i.e. corporate law scholars to start off with, might have some questions. And I believe we can take them on the chat function as well. So I'll keep an eye out on that. Oh, okay. So if people on Zoom, if you raise your hand, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, and I'll prioritize people in the room who are raising their hands at this point. I think, Kate, did you want to? No, that's okay. Yeah, yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. And I love that you came against this instrumentalist ground for equality. And if you're interested, we can continue this conversation. I think you'll work in that respect on a lot of links with what's happening in the peace and security literature at the moment. But two questions. I think the first one, I'm really drawn to this idea of how do we expand notions of diversity beyond women. And I just wonder if you talk about class. And how you talk about class, because that's a really difficult one, and it's very culture specific. In the UK, they tend to talk about class with respect to geography, so northern accent, for example, but I don't think we have the concept of vocabulary in Australia to talk about class. And when you hear about diversity, it's often, as you say, it's women, race, religion, age, disability, able-bodied, but very rarely do you hear the word class, especially in the corporate context. So that's my first question. The second question perhaps exposes my complete ignorance of this whole area. But when you were talking, I was really drawn to this idea of expanding diversity beyond the boardroom in corporations. And I thought about shareholders. I don't know if it's at all possible for a corporation to in any way influence the diversity of its shareholders. But I think what we've seen in the corporate space over the last few years is shareholders really, taking more action with respect to, for example, climate change and environmental policies of the corporation. And what I see in my area is there has been some motions put forward by shareholders for transport companies, in particular airlines, to no longer partake in the deportation of refugees. As far as I'm aware, they've all been sort of voted down. But I think that sort of indicates that, corporate policies, we have more diversity among shareholders, if that's possible, that can have a big influence on corporate policies, especially sort of justice.
Kate, I think before Akshaya answers, she's going to have to summarize that question so that we can make sure that the Zoom participants heard it as well.
No, that's okay. Thanks. Both great questions. And I think I can summarize it very easily. First question is about anything to do with class diversity. Second question is, can you have diversity in the shareholder group of companies? So I love the first question. I talk about it without actually mentioning class, but I say In prior work about Australia, I've spoken about how the companies that were spoken about in the Royal Banking Commission report, they all had 30% women on boards, but they all came from the same networks as the male directors there. So we haven't really opened up to outside networks. But in the book, I refer to research in the UK that looks at educational backgrounds. And it turns out that the directors of most of the top companies come from the same universities. And and I'm guessing it's the similar sort of thing for Ivy League universities in the US. And so, yeah, there is, and to talk a little about India, because I've done work on that, not in the book, but more generally, rather than class, I think they come from the same family groups that own companies. So I think there's something like this in every jurisdiction. And I think getting the education is one way to deal with it, I guess, because most people of a certain class attend certain schools. So that's a good way to address class diversity. But yeah, it's not been I think it's a great way to frame it, I guess. So thank you. Second question, also really interesting. And I'm looking at Stephen in the room who would love that question, I guess, about can you have diversity in the shareholder group? My take would be that shareholders are actually pushing, as you said, pushing for a lot of things. And I don't see that there's a deficit in shareholders not being activist enough, because there's at least some that are. And also a little to go back to the theories that I referenced, I think I take the whole director primacy view where directors and management have a lot more power. So shareholders can put proposals, but directors up to now have not been responding so much, but have started responding now because it's become a social media storm. So I guess they kind of respond more to reputational costs. So maybe irrespective of shareholder diversity, we're seeing a lot of activism from society in general and results from companies. So I think I'd probably not push for shareholder diversity, but I'm sure others would have other views there. So both great questions. Thanks.
A question, and Margaret. And there's nobody on Zoom at this stage? Okay, so Stephen.
The theory, of course, is the shareholders, by casting the vote, elect the directors. So we assume, in theory, that the shareholders are making an informed decision and they stop and think about it and they elect the people they want. A lot of the corporate companies to the contrary, that the board themselves have a lot of control over what's going on in an election process, either by the way they fill casual vacancies at board levels, so the shareholders are represented with a fait accompli, or the way in which they just sort of subtly influence the process. So the question there is, if you want the board to be diverse, how do you mandate that? And yeah, you mentioned Norway, for example, and other countries that have legislated that for board diversity on gender. The other way is you leave it up to the company to build that into its constitution to say, not only will the board have 9 directors, some of which are independent, but we also want to have the following. And I'm not aware that that's been done to a great extent. That depends on your views about what's the best way to mandate that diversity to get moved. Do we leave it to individual companies? Do we do it through legislation?
Thank you, Stephen. The question was, how can we best mandate diversity on the board? I think my answer in the book is I don't like mandating anything, but I do like to see diversity in corporations, and I want to see that coming from corporations. So I want to see true diversity. And I think I see your point about we haven't seen any voluntary responses so far. But I think in the recent past, even before in the US, even before the California and NASDAQ rules, there has been responses mostly to these sort of social movements, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, where companies So initially, companies started by making statements of support for Black Lives Matter. And I go into that in chapter 3 of the book. And then you have employees rather than shareholders call them out on social media saying, but what are you actually doing? You have these statements. And then they started coming out and saying, we'll hire diverse people, we'll hire, they gave themselves targets saying, we'll hire this amount of diverse people at this level. And again, I guess I was not very interested with the quantitative, the focus on quantitative targets, because now when the spotlight is on them, they're committed to targets. Maybe they'll meet those targets, but maybe those people will leave in a year if the culture isn't great. So I guess, and in chapter 5, I talk a little about Glassdoor and the type of companies out in the market where employees can leave anonymous reviews of how bad my company work culture is or how great it is. And people make informed choices about joining those sort of companies. And I think now post-COVID, the great resignation, etc., companies are trying to attract good, I mean, they're going out of the way to attract talent. So I think this is the right moment for them to actually innovate and say, we're doing these sort of things to retain diverse candidates.
Thanks. Now, I think Professor Margaret Thornton.
Thank you. I displayed also in terms of my limited knowledge in terms of corporate law, but I was interested to read a few articles about the shareholder actions that have been taken in the US in terms of sexual harassment and huge damages, you know, millions of dollars that are paid. And then the resolve is to actually shake up the company very significantly, because, you know, the shareholders argue in running these cases that what they're concerned about is the diminution in terms of their status and, you know, all those sort of things that redound against the company generally. And indeed, there was some evidence that the price of shares have actually gone down as a result of these, you know, the very significant cases where there have been serial harassers and, you know, all of that sort of thing that's received a lot of publicity in the US. So I was just wondering, you know, whether it was too early to assess what impact that might actually have in terms of diversity. I mean, the focus is invariably on women, because they have largely been the victims in these cases of sexual harassment.
So I'm not sure how best I can summarize this, but Margaret's question is the shareholder lawsuits against companies where there have been sexual harassment issues, and how was it too early to assess the financial impacts of those sexual harassment cases in terms. Okay. Okay, I get it. Yeah, so the question is whether these sorts of actions against companies with sexual harassment issues actually had an impact on diversity responses. And I've addressed this in the book, actually. I think it's really interesting that the whole Me Too movement has had an impact in the corporate space in terms of, one, there have been shareholder actions, as Margaret points out, but for every shareholder action there have been many more companies actually kind of preemptively reacting and thinking this may be us next. So there have been Me Too reps and warranties in M&A, transaction documents included now. So if there is like this sort of a serious complaints against key managerial personnel. So a rep saying no, there is a representation saying no, there is no such issue in our company. And there's also been, I think it's made its way into compensation discussions, for executive compensation discussions. So I think it's been really the impact has been really great in terms of the Me Too movement actually making its way to these sort of conversations. And my book is saying diversity issues are important enough to take them on to your company's risk management frameworks. And I think the types of things that have happened post Me Too are exactly going in that direction. So it's been good. And even like something like Uber, some employee posted their experience of sexual harassment on a blog post. And that made the company, because of the reputational fallout, not even a lawsuit, made the company hire an external consultant to review the culture of the company, etc. So I think these sort of things really call to question how companies are responding to negative information flowing out about it in this kind of social media age. So it's been one of the biggest drivers of companies doing more than just appoint people at the top, but also review their culture. So I think it's a really important issue going forward as well.
Oh, okay, thank you. We have some hands raised, and I'm sorry I didn't see what order they went up in. So I'm just going to read across the screen. And so, Anton, could you ask your question, please?
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Akshaya, for the presentation. As you were talking, I was struck by the thought that probably quite a lot of the considerations that you explore in your book could be applicable to different kinds of organizations, for example, government bureaucracies, political parties. And I was curious as to whether you have any thoughts so far on whether there is anything at all that makes corporations unique in terms of making a diversity-related considerations play out in a different way from the universe of other organizations out there. I suppose one of the salient features of corporations might be the more single-minded pursuit of a single objective, like profit, but I'm not quite sure. And so I was really curious in your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Anton. That's a great question. In fact, one of the subsequent projects that I'm thinking of after this book is like a collaborative work with a bunch of people thinking about diversity in different sectors. And I think with corporations, which I've looked at, so some of the research I've referred to in my book and previous work have drawn from diversity discussions in other areas. And I think the interesting thing about corporations is, you put it as the single-minded focus on profits, but I would say that's a really great incentive for corporations to care about their reputational costs, right? There's a focus on profits, and you want to look at, you can think of it as just financial profits, but also, are you making sure that consumers are still interested in interacting with you, still interested in buying from you? So you have different stakeholder groups that you need to keep happy to survive in monetary terms. So I think that's a really great incentive that corporations respond to, that not many other different areas. Yeah, I don't know how much, say the university sector, it has some incentives, but maybe not as much. So I've referred to some research in that context as well. Yeah, I think there's more that corporations, as in there's a positive that can come out of corporations having the single-minded profit focus, as you put it.
And Michelle Lynn.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. It's been very informative. My question kind of ties back to what you mentioned before about how you don't necessarily agree with having mandates. And I find that a very interesting perspective. So my question kind of loops back to culture and how there's an ethical component to diversity and inclusion, and how we can, I guess, how can we better create a culture where these types of ethical conversations are had in the workplace, and where we can foster that psychological safety, so that we can, from the bottom up, as an employee, how we can kind of affect change in that sense. Because I feel like typically we tend to hear about all of these things from the top down, and I'm, just from a bottom up perspective, I'm just interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think that's the direction I was going in chapter 5. I did want bottom up solutions, but I won't say exactly bottom up because I'm still saying that it has to get into the company's risk management framework. So the company needs to have mechanisms in place to kind of constantly hear from its employees about what's going wrong at various levels. But employees are only likely to report if they see that this company genuinely cares and is genuinely going to take action based on maybe is genuinely going to take action based on these sort of reports. So one of the and this is not just to do with diversity issues, even thinking about viewpoint diversity, where an employee has a very different idea from what the management is thinking. There can be like a suggestion box where the employee drops that idea. So if whether about equity issues or about anything else, if there is this culture of openness where employees can contribute, I think that's already an encouragement for employees to feel part of the organization and help improve the culture. But I also kind of discuss things like diversity training, which has become a common solution in most companies. And there's been a number of studies that show that it can have negative impacts if you kind of run those training sessions mandatorily and make the majority group feel like there is something wrong that everyone in this room is doing. So I think there should be a softer way, like I said, kind of don't enhance the fault lines more than it already is, rather encourage interaction beyond past these sort of group boundaries. One researcher, Professor Cindy Shipani, talks about maybe you can have senior female mentors for junior male colleagues in the firm. So it's normalized to see female mentors or female bosses. So I think these sort of innovative solutions are good. I also talk about surveying your workforce regularly, just to see what are we doing well, what are we doing badly, and then changing, taking exit interviews seriously. Where are the bottlenecks? Are all the racial minorities, women, or other types of diverse candidates leaving at a certain level in the hierarchy and not moving up? Why is that? So it could be something as simple as we don't provide flexible work opportunities beyond a certain point. So that doesn't mean everyone in that company is evil. It just means they need to figure out this is the problem and address it. So I think just taking a softer focus for both people at the top and bottom and having these conversations can be useful.
Jump in with a question. So you've been talking about you like there being a range of responses that are not coming from government, so it's not sort of top-down regulation, but it's sort of organic. And you've talked about social media as being a driver for, or something that companies respond to in terms of diversity issues. What I'm wondering about is there a concern for minority groups who may not have the social media presence or strength of numbers, or are not able to exert that sort of soft pressure in other ways? Like, is there an ideal of diversity that we might think is what we should be striving for? Is there a difference between that ideal and what the sort of diversity that will actually come from simply responding to society's current position, or, you know, the popular sense of what diversity is okay?
Thank you, Pauline. The question, I think it's really great. I'll try to summarize, and I actually do. I do talk about it in the book. I might have come off in one direction in today's talk, but Pauline's question is, if we rely too much on social media pressure, the popular sentiment, maybe there's some voices that are not getting heard, and should we actually have an ideal of diversity? I don't exactly frame it this way, but I think my skepticism about just relying on social media is the kind of short-term reactions we've seen. So I think in chapter 3, I give some examples to show how companies have, when there's a kind of negative media focus on any one, say, one CEO or one top management person in the company, the solution is usually just to get rid of the person, fire the person. Okay, this person was the problem, our company is fine. But really the problem would have been a lot more cultural, and they've done nothing to sort out those problems. So I think to that extent, I push back on just relying on social media, and instead I talk about how companies should be thinking about a long-term focus. But I think your question is trying to say, what about some diverse groups that are not able to make themselves heard through this social media um, uh, noise, if you can put it that way? And there's also research about how there's bots that really kind of amplify certain voices on social media, but are these the voices that need to be amplified? And I think we have enough of this policy discussion on what sort of diversity we need to be striving for. And companies know, to the extent that they like to, greenwashing, woke washing, whatever you like to call it, they like to show that, look, we know that these are the types of diversity we need to have. So we've done that. We just probably aren't hearing the voices of what is going wrong culturally, to are these sort of diverse candidates having issues beyond just not getting hired? And I think those come through if you allow for these sort of qualitative disclosures, and a company that comes out and says, we have ABC programs for diverse candidates, and the information, whether through social media or through companies like Glassdoor, comparably, which are actually which have surveys of employees who have worked in these companies. I think the information is there, and now we are kind of aware enough to look for that information before we join, at least the bigger companies. So yeah, hopefully that's that's a step beyond just relying on social media. There's yes.
This question, was there the type of industry that matters, like in construction, typically of IT, because I'm an engineer, and I remember like years ago that there were, when I studied, there were fewer people who did engineering, and that it's just a natural process. But some down the road, it's not. They really want to do the numbers. They have closed the gap, and they got to become a majority. Yeah, on stuff like that. We really think about that.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I think, to repeat, the question is about does the industry matter? And yes, to a certain extent, I've looked at it in the book, because when I look at the US and I talk about California and NASDAQ responding, but not really the rest of the country, there's probably two reasons for it. One, some have said, okay, there was this entire Me Too movement in Hollywood, and this is where the companies also responded. But also, this was the area with all the tech companies, with very few women in tech startups. So yes, definitely. And I think specifically on the tech sector, I've said that just mandate to have a diverse candidate on the board doesn't help that your entire workforce is lacking in diversity. So yeah, I think looking at it industry-wise helps, and that furthers my argument that we need firm-specific solutions rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, because each industry has a different issue. And I think you also mentioned towards the end of your question about how women might have increased a lot in a certain sector now versus in the past. And there's a funny story how in France, not in the corporate sector, but they have a similar quota legislation in government appointments. And I think a female mayor appointed more than 60% women, and she was fined. And because they have this gender neutral quota law, and there was kind of a lot of pushback for that, because till today it is kind of not uh, across sectors. We haven't reached this point of saying, okay, we just need gender neutral quotas. Women can be overrepresented in some areas, but we could get to those problems later. Certain sectors, maybe we see more women, but I don't think we've reached a point where there's too many women. And another reason I push back on quotas is sometimes startups may be trying to address this market problem of women not being hired, or other types of diverse people not being hired. Like in Brazil, there was a startup that hired only women. That was their policy. So if you have a mandatory quota, then probably there'd be someone challenging some such company. And I think it's good to have a market solution to a market problem. So we shouldn't kind of not allow that. Yeah.
Now, are there any other questions in the room? Any questions on Zoom? So I have one further question just for you to wrap up, I guess. And that is, do you have an example of either a particular company or a jurisdiction that is really getting this right, in your view? I mean, what's your, ideal in terms of corporate behavior and jurisdictional behavior?
Okay, so the question is any company, is any country getting this right?
A good news story.
Good news story. There's plenty of good things I identify from different companies. And the thing is, no company is doing everything right. And I think we shouldn't, this is another thing I push back on in the book, saying all corporations are evil is probably not the best, because then corporations will probably play to that image, right? Unless you give them a chance to also be good. So so it's great that you're asking me to highlight good stories. And funnily enough, the good comments on Glassdoor that came was from SpaceX. The Elon Musk is kind of so reviled in the public. But the things that came from SpaceX was that people were willing to give up. So they were willing to work for lesser pay to work in that company because the culture was good. And by culture, they were talking about how you could, anyone, no matter where you are in the hierarchy, could come up with an idea and that would be taken seriously. In Amazon, we all use Amazon Prime. Apparently, that idea came from someone who dropped a suggestion in the suggestion box. So it wasn't from the top. So it was a culture where people could give good, people could be heard from wherever. I think also, in terms of jurisdictions, so far, I really like how broadly the UK has defined diversity and how they're not mandating it, but rather they have these different reports saying that, look, you also need to look at racial diversity. You also need to look at, I think they look at gender and race, but in the corporate governance code, it's defined much in a wider way. So companies, if you look at their disclosures in the UK, are doing better than in other countries. So yeah, I think they're doing better. In the US, there could be more improvements from here in terms of, as I was answering Margaret's question about responses, having these reps and warranties in M&A transactions. So they've taken it seriously enough to bake that into compensation agreements, merger agreements, etc. So I think, yeah, it's a good news story, but it's coming slowly, I guess.
And Australia?
Australia, I think I haven't focused so much in the book. In the past, what I've looked at Australia, I think my main criticism was what I said earlier about how all the good news stories about numbers are mostly women from the same networks. And I think in Australia, my main argument is we need to start thinking of cultural diversity. And now I'll channel Kate and say class diversity. But before that, I was framing it as look outside existing networks.
Fantastic. So I might So thank you so much, Akshaya. That was a brilliant introduction to the book. It certainly is a jigsaw. You're making that very clear, and such a fascinating topic. And we look forward to seeing the book when it's actually here in hard copy. But congratulations and thank you for speaking tonight. And thank you very much, everyone who came along, and to those on Zoom.